Well, good morning. Last Sunday, if you were with us, we started a brand new 5-week series called Decisions. We're walking through some things about how do you make decisions, and then how do you make those decisions based on various intervals and things in life. And so if you would grab the message notes in the middle of your outline and grab an ink pen. If you don't have an ink pen and need one, raise your hand. One of our ushers will bring you one. We're glad that you're here. We're going to jump into this. I was reading just this past week about a little boy who was riding in the car with his dad, and a 5-year-old little guy was just kind of staring out the window, kind of off with his own thoughts. And finally he turns and he looks at his dad and he says, "Dad, are you afraid of spiders?" His dad said, "No." He said, "Well, are you afraid of ghosts?" He said, "No." "Oh, I'm not afraid of monsters." "So, Dad, you mean the only thing you're afraid of in life is mommy?" You know, all of us have things that we're afraid of in life. And the fact of the matter is, unfortunately, most people's lives and the decisions they make are driven by their fears rather than their hopes. They're driven by the fears that feed our anxieties rather than the hopes that would feed our faith. And this plays out in all kinds of spectrums in life. For instance, anybody know what the number one fear of the average American is? Talk to me. Fear of public speaking. That's right. That's why my knees are shaking while I'm up here this morning. Anybody know what the second fear in the United States is? Spiders. That's why we keep extra toilet paper at my house, because if there's a spider, she's not touching it. But we all have all kinds of fears. Some people, right this time of year, are very fearful of doing this thing called taxes. Some people get fearful every month when they get these little things that look like blue and gold emblems in the mail, and it's your Visa bill. As my wife would share with you, she has a fear of flying, which is ironic because she gets on a plane almost every Sunday afternoon to fly somewhere for business. My dad, who's kind of a man's man, is scared to death of heights. We all have things that we're afraid of. I have two real fears in my life. Fear number one is this. Anytime my wife orders something or brings something home, and on the box it says, "assembly required," scares me to death. Fear number two in my life, I'm afraid of failure. I don't want to fail at anything. I'm kind of a type A, high achiever kind of guy, and it plays out in every area of my life. But one of the things I've learned based on my experiences and the experience of people around me, sometimes fear is the difference between being effective and being very effective. It's a matter of how we navigate and negotiate this thing in fear, which all of us have to deal with at some level on the continuum of life. Now, I've told you before, if you're relatively new around here, the Bible's divided into two sections. You have the Old Testament, which was a lot of history about God creating the world and the original people that followed him. And you have the New Testament, which is all about the teaching of Jesus and how the early church began. And the fifth book in the New Testament is a book called Acts. And it's kind of the story about how the church began based on the teachings of Jesus and his death, burial, and resurrection, and how it began to explode. And one of the primary characters in the play in the book of Acts is a guy named Paul. He was kind of like the first initial missionary. And Paul had his success and his failures. Paul had went out and Paul started all kinds of churches. Paul also had all kinds of struggles. Paul was shipwrecked. Paul was stoned, the old-fashioned kind, not the more modern application. Paul was beaten. Paul had been subject of political and religious ridicule. And yet Paul used all of these things to continue to propel him to some pretty fruitful and effective ministry. Paul reached all kinds of people. He reached jailers and he reached sailors. He reached Republicans and he reached Democrats. He reached Roman officials and Jewish officials and Greek officials. He reached women in business and men in business, and he started all kinds of churches. But over the course of time, some of those brand new young churches began to unravel. And so Paul's going back out and doing kind of like round two to try and shore some of this up. And in that book called Acts, in Acts chapter 17, we read about this guy named Paul who's in this community called Athens. Now, Athens is kind of like a Midwest college town. It's a community of about 20,000 people, and it's a little bit past its heyday, but they still have areas there around the great teaching centers and educational centers where they have all kinds of philosophical discussions, and professors still have goatees with patches on their elbows, and there are really cool coffee houses where they get to hang out and have these kinds of discussions. And Paul has been teaching with them and conversing with them and philosophizing with them about various world religions and about this thing that they called the unknown God. And Paul was talking to them about, I know who that unknown God is. And he spent some time there, and it was an area that had a great climate, and he had some pretty good days. And, Athens was not unlike Athens, Ohio, or maybe South Bend, Indiana. It was very much Paul's comfort zone. It was an academic center, and he was very comfortable in academia. But there came a point in time when they got a little bit irritated with Paul, and essentially, they ran him out of town. And in doing so, Paul goes off a little bit north of where he's been hanging out to another city called Corinth. And this is way different than Athens, because Athens is this college town of about 20,000. Corinth is this metropolis in that day of over 100,000 people. It would be like leaving Mesa and going and doing a brand new job where you knew absolutely no one in the middle of New York City or London or Paris. It was that kind of dynamic. And in Athens, with all the academia, Paul was very much in his comfort zone. He knew how to have those discussions, and he had some friends around him. Now in Corinth, he knows no one, and Paul is facing some of his biggest fears because this city is really, really different. Let me tell you why. LJ, can we pop that slide up there? You see where that dot is? That's the city of Corinth in ancient Greece. Now, how many of you are familiar with the Panama Canal? A few of you, good. I was getting nervous for a second. Well, what happened there is you had all these ships that were kind of going around the known world at the time. And Corinth became an area where they could pull into there, and then what would happen is they could dock their ship. And they didn't dig it out like we've done the Panama Canal, but what they did is they cut down a bunch of trees and created these roller systems. And so they would put those ships onto those rollers and kind of roll it across that strait, rather than having those sailors who've been out for 4, 5, 6 months have to do an extra 500 miles down around the rest of that continent and an extra 4 to 6 months. They could cut that kind of time off. And it would take, depending on what was going on there in Corinth and how busy the port was, an average of about 4 days for those ships to be pushed across that little strait through Corinth and back out into the other bay that you can see there. Now, here's the problem. If you've got men who have been at sea for 4 to 6 months, and they come into town and they've got nothing to do for 4 or 5 days, what kind of stuff do they get into? Yeah, all kinds of stuff. They're into gambling. They're into prostitution. They're into fights and drunkenness and brawling. And Corinth actually looked a lot like this. This was the sign at the edge of Corinth when they came in. And Corinth even had a motto. They said this to all those sailors: what happens in Corinth? No, that's not right. But I know where some of you are spending your weekends now. This was literally their saying. What happens in Corinth catches an unfortunate disease. That was the reputation. In fact, the city actually did have a sign. It wasn't quite like that. But their motto was to live like a Corinthian. And then the unofficial motto became, yeah, because you catch an unfortunate disease. And you've got all that going on. And it was like a 24/7, 365 spring break party. And Paul's out of his comfort zone, and he's hanging out in this city because he got driven out of the other one. And he's in this seedy little dingy motel room. It's got rust stains, he hopes, there on the bed and there on the shower floor. And Paul is really, really struggling. And here's the deal. Because he's so far out of his comfort zone, and he's in such unusual circumstances, Paul's scared to death. Scared to death. Now, what's interesting here is the Bible makes it very clear. In that moment, in these circumstances, God doesn't remove Paul's fears and free him from these circumstances. What God chooses to do is give Paul the opportunity to face his fears and then choose whether he's going to yield to his fears or he's going to step through his fears and live in faith based on the promises of God. It's a pretty cool story. It's there in your outline. You can follow along on the stream. We're going to look at Acts chapter 18 and read some of these introductory verses. Meaning after he got kicked out of Athens, Paul left Athens and he goes to Corinth, and there he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. So you see, Paul meets a couple of people who also got kicked out of a city based on their ethnicity. And Paul went to see them. And because he was a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and worked with them. And every Sabbath, he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. And when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent of it all. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." And then Paul left the synagogue, and he went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. And Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. And one night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. He said, "Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one is going to attack you or harm you, because I have many people in this city." Now, based on this passage, which describes Paul's response to circumstances that were overwhelming to him, inside your worship notes there, we've got 4 principles about how God strengthens us in this life. If you want to follow along, principle number 1 says this: believe God can use any circumstance to build great relationships and create new opportunity. Believe God can use any circumstance to build great relationships and create new opportunity. I told you a few moments ago that I'm pretty type A and I have to win at everything. And I wish I could tell you that was something that just happened and, was in my 20s and 30s, but I think I came out of the womb like that. And I clearly remember that when I was 11 years old, we lived out in the hills of southern Ohio. And one day, my family, my sisters and parents and I, we were down about a mile down the road at our nearest neighbors, which are our cousins. And we were out in their barnyard playing hide and go seek. Now, my cousins' family, they weren't farmers in the vocational sense, but they had a lot of livestock and cattle and farming type things. And out there playing hide and go seek in the barnyard, I was hiding on the backside of the barn when I realized that the people who were doing the seeking were coming around, and I basically was kind of stuck. I hadn't really thought this through because I didn't realize that since I had been down to my cousin's house a week or two ago, the last time, that they had brought in a bull because they had a lot of really, really happy heifers. And the bull had a pen on the backside of the barn. And that pen was surrounded by an electric fence because of all the heifers. And I had considered, well, if I go back, they're probably going to catch me, and I don't want to lose. And if I go around, we're going to be here till like next Tuesday, and that's no fun. And I got this bright idea. I bet I can crawl through that fence and go out the other side. Now, you got to understand, where I grew up in the hills of Ohio, we had horses and cattle. Electric fences were no big deal. I'd bumped a couple of them. It was kind of like a sweat bee sting. It's a pinch. It stings for a second. You notice it, but it doesn't really hurt you. And I told my other cousin, I said, I'm going to go through this fence. And the bull wasn't really paying attention to me. He's over there eating, and I'm going to go out the other side of this barn. And so I lined it up, and something out of Matrix. And I'm climbing through when my arm touches down and bumps that electric fence. The next thing I know, I'm waking up on the other side of that pen. You guys think it's funny? You guys are masochistic. I didn't realize that because you had a 2-ton bull and a whole bunch of happy heifers over here, that the voltage was like maxed out on that thing. It literally shocked me and propelled me to the other side of that barnyard. Now, I'm okay now. There's no lingering drain damage. And Paul's in these circumstances. And Paul is not happy. And Paul is scared. And God's reminding Paul, hey, Paul, I'm not unaware of the circumstances, but if you'll trust me, there's a method to my madness, if you will. And what God does is Paul is a tent maker. That's how he's earning his living and paying his rent in this brand new city. And he meets some other people on the job who are also tent makers, a husband and a wife combination named Aquila and Priscilla. They too are followers of Jesus. And when they meet Paul, there's something electric about that relationship. And there's something that happens in this relationship that takes all of Paul's fear and discouragement and encourages him. And like electric shock, it propels Paul into opportunities he would never have had he hid in the safety of his hotel room and never come out. Check out what verse 2 says. It says, there he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy because they got kicked out because they were of the wrong lineage. And Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. And when Paul went to see them, go on the next slide, he said, let us renew our trust in God and go forward without fear. So Paul goes to see them. And then here's what happens. They start having this conversation. And Paul's sharing his circumstances, and they're sharing together as people faithing do, like some of you in a small group might do. And it connects and it propels Paul into these unprecedented opportunities. See, I don't know what your greatest fear or circumstance within that fear is. For some of you, you might be underwater in your mortgage, and you're scared about that. Some of you may have children who have gone off to college and they have forsaken all the faith that they learned growing up, and you're fearful, literally, for their lives and their eternities. Maybe your circumstance of struggle is you love children and you've always wanted to have children, but you can't get pregnant. Maybe you've got a job issue. Maybe you've got a marriage issue. Maybe you've got a family issue. And you've got struggles in your life. And you're facing that struggle and you're wanting to back down. You're wanting that struggle eliminated. And you stand on this precipice where you have to decide, are you going to yield to your fear? Or are you going to step through your fear and build your life on the promises of God? Because every fear at some point in time becomes an opportunity to do something you would have never otherwise done. And usually it's based on a relationship that you encounter in the midst of that fear. Some of the greatest joys, experiences, and achievements in my life have come directly on the heels of some of the greatest pain in my life, some of the greatest sorrows in my life, some of the greatest circumstances of struggle in my life. And usually as I'm going through that, I make an acquaintance who becomes a certain type of relationship that opens opportunities, and then I can choose to pursue those opportunities, or I can choose to cower back and allow myself to be smothered with my pain and my circumstances and my fear. For instance, because of one of the greatest struggles in my life that represents one of the greatest moments of pain in my life, I met a man named John Jackson, who is now a college president. Because John Jackson was a man of certain influence, and there was something about me that he liked even in the midst of that downward turn in my life. I have been privileged to literally travel the world and teach leadership and public speaking in places that I barely knew existed on a map. Because of that relationship on the heels of some of my greatest pain, I have been privileged to literally raise what now amounts to millions and millions of dollars for AIDS orphans in Africa. Because of certain relationships that represent other times of emergence from pain and circumstances in my life. I had the privilege not too long ago of meeting a little group of people who were gathering in a storefront at an intersection called Greenfield in Maine, trying to determine what they were going to do about their lives of faith and the kind of church they wanted to become. And bam, next thing you know, that church called Connect is meeting in the Silver Star Theater while it builds out a state-of-the-art facility in a Walgreens across the same parking lot. I wouldn't be standing here in front of you this morning, and I wouldn't know your names had I not gone through some of the greatest pain in my life that led somebody into my life that formed a relationship that introduced me to some of you that led us to this point this morning. That's why those words of Abraham Lincoln are so important. Let us renew our trust in God and go forward. How? Talk to me. Without fear. Which leads me to my second thought there in your worship folder. Put it up on the screen if you would, please. Quit stressing out because of critics and start listening to the call of God. Do you know who the most insecure people on the face of the earth are? Junior high kids. Because think about junior high kids. You've got 12, 13, 14-year-old little girls who are now starting to form the bodies of young women, but they still have the minds and the emotions of little girls. And so what they do is they build up this drama all around them, right? Some of you are little junior high girls. It's okay to nod your head yes. And they build this drama, and the only way they know how to overcome their own insecurities is to be critical or cynical or demeaning of other girls in their class. Am I close to being accurate? And then here's the problem. The only people on the earth more insecure than junior high girls are junior high boys. Because junior high girls mature physically more rapidly than junior high boys. But junior high boys begin to notice junior high girls, but junior high girls don't notice junior high boys. Junior high girls notice what? High school boys. And I've been there. It's ugly, it's embarrassing, it's awkward. I'm glad we don't have videos from those days. But like when I'm in the 7th grade, I found out that, hey, I'm not a half bad football player. I got to start on the 8th grade football team. But anytime I made a mistake, I had all these insecurities like, oh no, does that mean the coach is going to cut me at practice this week? Does that mean the teacher won't like me anymore? And while I still liked football more than I liked girls, I was readily becoming aware that girls like football players. Does that mean they won't like me because I messed up? It's a horrible place. Thank God he only allows it to last for about 2.5 years. But there's a lot of drama based on junior high mentality, and some people never outgrow the drama that they learned in junior high school. And they want to live in drama all the time. Have you been there? Now, Paul has some of this drama happening in his life and in his experience. Let's pick this up at verse number 6. Check this out. But when they opposed Paul, talking about these other religious leaders and people, they became abusive. And he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent of it. From now on, you're on your own. I'm going to the Gentiles. See, Paul understood there was a time where you had to stop taking all the criticism. You had to stand your ground, and you had to stare differences, which represent insecurities and fears, in the face rather than yield to them, or you'd never make any progress in life. And Paul's got all of this criticism going on. He's got all of this drama happening around him. And the only way we ever move beyond the junior high drama queens in our lives is to stand our ground and point out the difference and then walk away. You know, we all have critics in our lives. And if you're new to church and somebody invited you here this morning and told you we had pretty good coffee, number one, I'm glad you're here. Number two, I wish I could stand here and tell you that inside the church there's never any criticism, but the fact of the matter is there are some people who just think they have the spiritual gift of criticism. And if I'm going to be completely honest with you, you might be sitting with one. No, I'm just kidding. But Paul says there comes a point in time where you're going to have to choose to overcome your own insecurities, and shut out the voices of the critics around you and turn your back and walk away. Have you guys lived long enough to know that there are just some people who aren't happy unless there's drama in their lives? If you're sitting next to one of them, raise your hand. No, don't do that. But it's real important that you learn how to deal with this, that you do these types of things and shut off that criticism. Here's why. If you do not, that criticism starts playing up your fears, and those fears feed your anxieties. And in the process of all of that, if you're not careful, you can derail your marriage based on your own fears, whatever they are. You can derail your family you can derail the future of your children. You could derail your job. You could derail your career. Unfortunately, you could derail this church based on your fears if you choose to give in to your fears instead of step into faith. And Paul says, we don't want that. And so Paul says, I've got to turn my back on you and walk away. You're on your own because you're living in your own fears, and I can't go there. Now, Paul picks this on up and gives us some more insight. In verse number 9, take a look at this. He says, one night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. Now, let me stop right there. I've been working on this conversation that we're having this morning for several weeks, probably several months. I'm also not immune to the fact that there was big news this week, at least from a Christian and a church's perspective, about an on-air personality for one of the major networks who commented that our vice president, who says that he talks with God and God talks to him, but because of that, makes him mentally ill. Now, here's what I want you to understand. At first, when I saw that, it irritated me really bad. And about 20 minutes later, when I took a step back and processed it, here's what emerged out of my own thinking. Most of the time in life, when people are critical, what they are doing is they are speaking critically or negatively about something they don't really understand. And if we're not careful, that could happen to any one of us in here. That's why we have great political divide. We don't really seek to understand each other. We just want to overwhelm each other. We have the same thing going on in the church. We have the same thing going on in this. And so it's easy to criticize something we don't understand. And so my hope for you, whatever circumstance you find yourself in, rather than initially your first expression being one of criticism, why don't you first seek to understand and then move forward? Enough said? Now let's go on with this. One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. So you know, God actually speaks to people. It's written in his word. And he says, do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. Now, there are a couple of things happening there that we kind of need to understand. Why is it so important that the writer says one night specifically? Why didn't he just say, hey, once upon a time, God spoke to Paul? It's because it's really important, and there's some real value in this for you and me this morning. See, we've already learned that Paul was a tent maker, correct? That meant back in that day, because they didn't have electricity and some of the things that we enjoy, Paul got up about 5 or 6 in the morning when the light came up and he went off to work. And basically, Paul worked till dark because that's when he could see. And then when dark came, he left his tent making job and he went home. And so the Bible is letting us know that after Paul had done his day job, after he had worked from daylight to dusk, Paul goes, and then Paul takes the time intentionally to get alone with God, to spend time with God. It's the reminder that for all of us who would consider ourselves followers of Jesus, that there is great value and real importance in spending time with God. Because if you try to have a conversation with God in the midst of the chaos on the run throughout the day, it's like listening to something that's in between 2 radio stations. It's just fuzzy voices and it drives you nuts, correct? It's tough to do this over the dinner table when kids are throwing spaghetti sauce and ice cream at one another. It's tough to do this in the hallways when you're passing people and you're also trying to have a conversation with God. When Tammy and I have things of great importance that we need to talk about in our lives, in our marriage, about what's going on with our personal finances or our jobs, we sit down and we look one another in the eye and we have the special time to have that important conversation. And in the same kind of way, God has important conversations he wants to have with you, and unless you prioritize a time to be alone with him, you never really hear clearly what God wants to say to you. Is that fair? And then it's really interesting to me that the first thing that we're told in the midst of all this story that God actually says to Paul is what? You see, in the Old Testament, which is primarily the book about Jewish history, if you will, and introductory to God and God's love for humankind, and in the New Testament, which is all about the teachings of Jesus and how God shares his love for humankind through his Son, every time God comes to somebody for whom he is about to utilize to do something special and significant in their lives and for his sake. The first words out of God's mouth every time, do not be afraid. Now, why does God tell people to not be afraid? Because we're afraid. It's not rocket science. He's done it for you. He did it for Paul. He's done it for me. Paul, and he's saying, hey, look, I've got great things, but you're never going to get to them if you continue to be scared every step of the way. I'm not going to remove this fear from you. I'm going to encourage your trust in me, and then together we're going to do this. And I love what Rick Warren says about this kind of thing. Here's what Rick says. If you go to the next slide for me. It says, never let praise go to your head, and never let criticism go to your heart. Isn't that pretty cool? Now, I want to back up to verse number 10 because there's something real important here we've all got to get. He says, do not be afraid. Why? For I am with you. There in your worship folder, circle the word with. It's a very powerful word. We're going to come back to it in just a second. And no one is going to attack you and harm you because I have many people in this city. Now, we read that verse, and the first thing we want to do is we want to run straight to I have many people. Oh, Paul, you should be comforted. There's all kinds of Christians out there in Sin City, and they're all just going to come flocking to you. That's not what God's saying at all. First of all, you have to understand the power of with. God is not saying, hey, Paul, while you go do your thing, I'm going to stand over there and watch you and cheer you on. Paul, while you go do your thing, I'm going to stand back here and make sure you get there. Paul, while you go do your thing, I'm going to run on ahead. I'll have lunch. You catch up when you're done. God is saying, Paul, while you do your thing, I am doing your thing with you. In a kind of a silly kind of way. Imagine this morning that you could crawl inside my hoodie. And we're doing this church service. You're inside my hoodie. While I'm up here sharing this conversation with everybody else, if you're inside my hoodie, are you sitting at your seat? Are you out in the lobby or in the restroom somewhere? No, if you're inside my hoodie, you're up here what? With me. That's what it means. It means that wherever you are, so too is God. Whatever you are going through, God is going through with you. Whatever you're experiencing, you're not experiencing alone. God is with you whenever, wherever, however, and whatever. You're never facing life. You're never facing a fear. You're never facing an obstacle all by yourself. You know why? Because in this life, if you are facing that fear, you are facing that obstacle, you are facing that kind of thing that is the difference between effective and very effective, about 99.9% of the time you would back down and you would never go through. And in the process, you'd never know the power, the glory, and the wonderment of the God who gave you life. And God says, I am with you. And then he says, and I have many people in this city. It's not like there were thousands and thousands of Christians in that city, and Paul, you just got to get on the right Facebook page and find them all and get invited to their gatherings. Well, there were some followers of Christ there. That's not what is being said. What God is saying is, Paul, when you come through this fear, and I'm going to go through it with you, when you come out on the other side of that fear, there are many people in this city that you're going to get the chance to tell them about my goodness. There are all kinds of sailors who are getting off those ships. There are all kinds of business people who run the bright lights in the big city. There are all kinds of business owners, and I'm going to give you influence with all of these people because, Paul, to live like a Corinthian is a life of death. You've got to teach them what it means to live like a child of God. And then I think about us. And I think about this community. And if the words in the Bible that were true for Paul can also be true for us here in Mesa, what I hear God saying through this is connect. I have many people in this city who want to get involved with unleashing compassion on the needy in this city. I have many people in this city who are looking for a safe place to bring their real questions and discover real answers. I have many people in this city who are looking for the grace that only God can bring while they deal with the struggles and adversities that life has brought. I have many people in this city, Connect Church, that I want you to have influence over. I want you to share life with. I want you to do meals with. I want you to share a journey with. I have many people in this city for you. See, that's part of the reason that our connection groups, if you've been a part of another church, maybe you call them small groups or life groups. Our church name's Connect, so we have to connect everything. So we have connection groups. But that's why they're so important. Number one, it's a reminder that you're not in this life alone. Number two, it gives you an opportunity to share life. Life's good and its joys, life's bad and its adversities. With the reminder, with a physical representative that God is with us. If you're not yet in one of our connection groups, stop at the kiosk. It's really clear. It says connection groups. And stop. We have them every day of the week. Find one that fits your schedule. If one doesn't fit your schedule, let us know your schedule. We'll find a letter and we'll build a new one based around you. Because we are in this together. We are, another way of saying that is we are in this with one another. Let's go on to thought number 3. We're running out of time. He says, make and keep commitments. We had a kid in another church in our youth group who loved sports. His name was Eric. And Eric was actually a pretty good athlete, but he was a little bit small. And had he gone to school like I went to, he'd have been just fine. But it just so happened that the school he went to was kind of like a football powerhouse. And the guys that he was seniors with were the guys that would go on and start, like at UCLA or USC or Ohio State and Stanford as freshmen and sophomores. But he was a good athlete. He was very popular. They kept him on the team, but he didn't really get to play a lot because they had all of these like Division I prospects playing in front of him. But about game 7 or 8, they were playing one of the big rivals, and the winner of this game usually each year went to the state playoffs. And the guy in front of Eric, the starter, got hurt, and Eric's in the game. And Eric's team is up 4 points with approximately 10 seconds left in the game. But the other team has the ball inside the 10-yard line looking to score the winning touchdown, which would mean they would win the game. And Eric's playing in the defensive backfield. I forget whether he was a cornerback or a safety. And I can't really tell this like Eric can, but here's what happened. Inside the 10-yard line with a few seconds left, the quarterback on the other team goes back to throw the ball. Eric's small. Most everybody else is larger. He doesn't see Eric, and when he throws the ball, Eric's like right there. He's in the end zone. He just jumps up and catches the ball 5 yards deep in the end zone. Clock's running out. Eric, instead of kneeling down there, takes off running down the sideline. And all of the other players and all of his coaches are going, lay down, lay down, lay down, because football's a crazy game. They're afraid that somebody hits him, he fumbles, the other team picks the ball up, runs it back for a score. If he just drops to his knee, game over, team wins. But Eric's a senior. Eric hasn't had a lot of playing time. He's not going on to college on a scholarship. Eric's never scored a touchdown. Eric keeps on running. The coach is running alongside him on the sidelines, going, lay down, lay down. Eric finally is thinking, but I'm going to get a chance to score a touchdown. I'll probably never play another game the rest of my life. I'll never get a chance to score. He's at the other 10-yard line when he turns to his coach on the sideline going, you lay down. And he runs in and scores a touchdown. You know what? Sometimes in life, you just got to look at other people's voices and their criticisms and their own self-interest and say, you lay down. I'm turning my fear into an opportunity to do something I may never get to achieve the rest of my life. I'm going forward. I'm going to make it happen. I'm not yielding to fear. I'm not yielding to insecurity. I'm not yielding to adversity. I'm going to accomplish something I may never get a chance to accomplish again if I don't take advantage of this opportunity, no matter what fear is in my life. And that's exactly where we find Paul with all of this. Take a look at this verse. It says, so Paul stayed in Corinth for 1.5 years, teaching them the Word of God. In other words, Paul found a way to channel through his fears, to overcome them, to step through his fear into faith, and begin to do the kinds of things that Paul needed to do. He stuck to his commitment. And a lot of us have got commitments in life that we've not been great at keeping. In fact, if I'm going to be really forthright with you this morning, here's the deal for probably most of us in this room. We don't need to make any more commitments. We just need to keep the commitments we've already made. I used to work in juvenile social work with the kids who were the worst of the worst of the worst. And when those kids would come into our program and they were assigned to my caseload, I would tell them, whatever circumstances brought you here, if you will allow this program to work for you and you will work this program, if you will allow me to work with you, by the time you would graduate high school, or the time you would graduate this program, or by the time the courts would say, okay, you've done enough to be sent back to wherever it is you came from, someday you could graduate high school. You might even graduate college. You could be a great dad, a great mom. You could lead a corporation someday. And every single one of those students, not like most of them, not like half of them, not like 90% of them, but every single one of them told me the exact same thing. David, no one's ever told me that before. And then as I would start working with them, and we would have conversations, and I would be getting to know them a little bit, I would eventually ask them in the midst of the relationship, whatever mess or struggle that you're in, how did you get here? And every single one of them, not like 50% of them, not most of them, not 90% of them, every single one of them would look at me and they would identify 2 or 3 intense moments of pain in their life that caused them to have a certain reaction that exhibited a certain behavior. And every single time, there was a direct link between that moment of intense pain and an adult who had broken a commitment to them and let them down. I don't mean something came up. I don't mean there was minor disappointment. I mean some adult who broke a major commitment and caused pain in this student's life. And folks, in our marriages, in our personal relationships, in our jobs, in this church, I think we could echo the words of Scripture that say, let your yes be yes and let your no be no, that when you make a commitment, you keep your commitment. Now, Paul essentially kept his commitment and stayed there in Corinth teaching as a way of thanking God for breaking through his fears and giving him opportunities to reach a whole city that never would have otherwise been reached had not Paul worked through those circumstances. But there's a real interesting verse there in your worship notes. It's this verse. At the end of chapter 18, it says, Paul stayed in Corinth for some time. And then he left the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Again, this electric shock. They're doing life together. They're working through these things. But before he sailed, Paul had his hair cut off, at whatever that is, because of a vow he had taken. Now, here's what's interesting. Again, Paul has this Jewish background. So if you go back in the Old Testament, which is all of the Jewish history, and you go to the book of Numbers and you go into chapter 6, there is kind of this extreme, almost radical group of men called Nazarites. And they would shave their heads in a certain vow that would proclaim this almost radical commitment to what it was they were pursuing back in that particular era. And it was like a form of accountability to them, that they were telling the rest of the world, this is who I am. And then you go from Numbers chapter 6 to Deuteronomy chapter 6, and it gives you an understanding of some of the things that they did and how radical their commitment was. And what Paul was saying is, hey, I have had a great experience here. I've battled through my fears. And as a way of expressing my commitment and being accountable to the entire world that I am going through with this, no matter what the cost, I'm going to shave my head so that everybody will know I'm different. It's kind of like why we wear wedding bands. Or it's why in certain inner cities, kids will wear a jacket or a rag or collars, because they are making a proclamation of their commitment to whatever that cause is that invites accountability into their lives. And quite frankly, for some of us to keep the commitments we have made in our marriage, in this church, in our jobs, to our families, Another reason we need to be in one of our connection groups is because some of us need a little bit more accountability that helps keep us focused on the path that's before us, that keeps us from reverting to junior high drama. One last thought pretty quickly. Number 4 is this. Learn and apply the Word of God. And you're like, David, this has actually been a pretty good conversation. Why are you getting all church cliche on me here about applying the Word of God? Well, the fact of the matter is, I'm doing that because way too many people don't actually read the Word of God. Now, when I say way too many people, I'm not talking about culture at large. I'm talking about people who call themselves Christians, who attend church and would say that they're going to heaven when Christ returns. In fact, look there in your notes, but look at this next slide. I want to point something out to you. See, most Christians, now here's what I want you to do. Circle that word Christians. Circle that word Christians. Why is that important? If you're here this morning and you would say, David, I respect the church, but I'm not a Christian. I don't consider myself a follower of Jesus. One, we're glad you're here. Thank you for taking a chance on us. But secondly, for the next 3 to 5 minutes, I'm not talking to you. Go get a cup of coffee, go to the bathroom, come back in for the closing song. Most Christians have 3 responses when it comes to the Bible. Response number 1 is this. We simply ignore it. We say we buy into it, but we don't actually open it and see what God has to say. In fact, but the bottom line is everything that goes on in the name of Christianity, the church, comes from this as a love letter from God to his people. And outside of that familial love that begins with one we acknowledge as Father, none of the rest of the Bible makes sense. And then what we want to do is we want to just build life on it, but we're ignoring it. You know, over the years in ministry, I've been in enough people's houses, and I've sat at enough kitchen tables and enough family rooms drinking coffee and tea and meeting enough people to know that I always walk by one room that looks better than every other room in the house. It's called the formal living room. I think they're only in there to add square footage so you can pay more taxes and contractors make more money. Because they're always pristine, the carpet's always clean, and there's always a Bible sitting there with dust on it that never gets opened. Why? We just ignore it. We'll come to church on Sunday. David, you tell us what we need. I like this little folder thing. I don't actually have to open my Bible or my Bible flat screen that you're holding there in the palm of your hand. But we ignore it. Second thing is this. We want to trivialize it. What we do is we want to focus on all these biblical and theological semantics, and then we want to do stupid stuff like go on Facebook and social media and express our opinion of somebody else's opinion about somebody else's opinion of the Bible, but we've ignored it, we've never read it, so we don't really know what we're talking about. And so we get to play Bible trivia in front of the whole world, and we just look stupid because we've not spent any time getting to know the author of the Bible through the words of the Bible. We just want to play Bible trivia with everybody else, usually based on all of our biases. And then what happens is we do this thing, we politicize the Bible, and that was never God's intention. Do you still love me? You're a little weak, I'm just checking. Now there is a third group. There are those of us in this room and in churches around the world today who actually live out the teachings of the Bible. And you and I and the rest of the world can tell the difference. We can look around and see the difference. See, everything I've talked about that has to do with how you overcome fear and live in faith, how you overcome the criticism, how you overcome the junior high drama queens, how you step through the issues in your life that would hold you back, how you build the relationships that would propel you like electric shock, is all based on the practical understanding of this thing we call the Bible. It's just so practical. And if we spend a little bit of time in it, we'll learn a little bit more about God, and quite frankly, we'll learn a little bit more about ourselves every step of the way. So I want you to bow your heads. I'm not going to linger here for more than just like 10 seconds. But if you would say, hey, David, thank you for this conversation this morning. I hear you talking, and God's talking to me while you're talking. And there are one, maybe even 2 things this morning that you've addressed that I'm struggling with, and I want God's help with this. Would you just lift your hand up and down? That's all you got to do. Up and back down. That's it. That's it. Father, thank you so much for the practicality of your word. Thank you for sharing yourself with us. Thank you, God, for the folks who listened to your voice this morning, and they have acknowledged that there are some things in their lives that relates to fear and insecurity, Or maybe an understanding of a Bible that they say they believe in, but they never spend any time in. And God, I don't say that judgmentally. I don't say that in a grandiose kind of way. I say that as a fellow sojourner who understands the ups and downs of life, who's got his own share of pain and adversities and difficulties. But because of your grace and your goodness, can also testify that you live out in our lives what's written about in the lives of others in this book we call the Bible. And so God, I would pray that you would give courage where courage is needed, and hope where hope is needed, and faith where faith is needed. That maybe you would introduce a relationship that will allow somebody to walk through whatever struggle or circumstance or adversity, be it in their marriage, be it with a private hurt, habit, hang-up. Maybe it's a job thing or a family thing. And they're one relationship away from being propelled into a future that they don't even begin to imagine. Father, thank you for your goodness. Thank you for sharing this morning with us. Thank you for the hope that we have because of your Son, Jesus the Christ, in whose name we pray. And everybody said, folks, thanks for your time. I appreciate it.